For most people, Beethoven's Für Elise is just a pleasant-sounding piece of music, nothing more. It's simple, easy to remember, and doesn't require deep musical knowledge from the listener. In academic circles, however, it's perceived as so overplayed that sometimes it seems better not to mention it in polite society. But today, let's put aside all prejudice and take a fresh look at this piece. The piece consists of 5 sections, with the first section repeated 3 times without changes. The other 2 sections are unique. Essentially, it's structured like 3 choruses and 2 verses. In professional terms, this is a rondo form with 3 refrains and 2 episodes. As it's often the case, people remember only what repeats the most, the refrains or the choruses. But the irony is that this is just the outer shell of the piece. The most important elements lie in the other 2 sections, which are always forgotten. But in fact, the entire drama of the piece is built upon their contrast. But let's go step by step. Für Elise translates from German as For Elise. We don't know exactly to whom Beethoven dedicated this piece. There were several women with that name in his circle. But one thing is certain. Beethoven was extremely unlucky in love. He proposed multiple times, but none of his beloveds ever agreed to marry him. By the age of 40, he was also suffering from severe hearing loss. Losing hearing would be a major blow for anyone, but don't forget that Beethoven was also a composer. On top of that, he had chronic stomach problems, accompanied by pain that was exacerbated by constant stress. Against this backdrop, illness, repeated romantic failures, and finally hearing loss, he even contemplated suicide at one point, but he didn't go through with it. Despite everything, he continued composing great music. And all additional materials you can find on our Patreon. One more important detail. During Beethoven's lifetime, he never published Für Elise. The world only learned about the piece 40 years after his death. Beethoven lived to be 56. Now that we know all this, let's listen to what the genius composer wrote at his 40 for one of his beloveds. The first section. It's strict, restrained, and aristocratic. It's a reflection of the social culture of that time. Let me remind you that Beethoven lived 200 years ago, moved in high society, and attended palaces, dinners, and dances. Next comes Section B. Section B is something entirely different. It's bright and warm. Within the context of the piece, this is the first truly significant section. While the first section was cool and neutral, the second is filled with warmth, joy, and inspiration. Compare the poetic freedom of the second section with the restraint of the first. It doesn't really matter what you imagine. Everyone is free to imagine something of their own. Music doesn't convey visual images, but what no one can change is the music itself, its drama, and its sequence of events. As I mentioned before, unlike the first section, The music here breathes freely. Beethoven also doesn't forget about playfulness and fun. Unfortunately, these emotions don't last long. The music quickly freezes, the thought lingers, and eventually we return to the very beginning. But what happens next? Next we have the cold, dark, severe and tragic section C. As you might guess, the emotions here are also deeply personal, perhaps even more so than in the second section. This is also the climax of the entire piece, and also the last thing Beethoven wanted to show us, because we won't hear anything new anymore. This section is what immediately comes to my mind when someone mentions this piece. It starkly contrasts with everything else. Here we hear the real Beethoven. This section is truly harsh. It's full of sorrow, pain, and a deep internal struggle. However, it ends with a slight brightening, a small ray of hope, not for mutual love, of course, but for the will to live. Let's listen to this moment. Immediately after this brightening, the music quickly settles down, fades away, and after a short transition, we return to section A. But now, after this confession, after this overcoming, after all this storm of emotions in sections B and C, the repetition of section A sounds especially cold. Words alone cannot convey this effect. You need to listen to the piece from beginning to end, watching the sections change. Even though the notes remain the same, the context is entirely different. Beethoven is a composer of the first Viennese school, but unlike his contemporaries, he already had one foot in Romanticism. At first glance, Für Elise is a simple rondo, but the two central episodes fill it with depth. They act as two opposing charges, one positive, the other negative. On one hand, we have the feeling of love and fullness, on the other, deep loneliness. In just 3 minutes, we hear an entire life story unfold. Love, disappointment in love, and in the end, just a gallant bow. But it's important to remember, music doesn't convey specific visual images. Everyone can imagine something of their own. But what no one can change is the music itself, its drama, and its sequence of events. Für Elise is a deeply tragic piece, yet it remains a modest trifle in form and size. I sincerely recommend you to listen to Für Elise from beginning to end, clearly imagining which section of the piece you are in. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and become a member of our community on Patreon.